is a massive private equity firm, and what a private equity firm does is essentially raise money from wealthy individuals and companies and funds, and then turns and invests that money in a slightly higher risk form of investing than, say, the stock market or the bond market.
What they do is they buy the stock directly from the company. They take ownership shares and often controlling shares, but they do not buy it on the public market. And they often have control of the companies they buy, which means that they do not have to, because the companies are privately owned, privately controlled, they don't have to, they're not subject to the securities exchange laws in this country.
They'll purchase the company for a fraction of what it's really worth, and then turn the company around and sell it off for a huge profit. It's called the buyout practice.
The list of knowledgeable institutional investors in aerospace defense is a fairly short list. And I think it would be widely acknowledged that at the top of that list is the Carlyle Group, located here in Washington, D.C., and considered by most people to be the premier investor in aerospace defense over quite a number of years.
What is new about Carlyle is the size and the dimension of their success. My understanding is they are now the 11th or 12th largest defense contractor, a multi-billion-dollar annual enterprise with an almost obscenely high profit margin.
So please welcome Frank Finelli. Frank?
Well, super. It's great to be here back at the conferences that are put on here. As Jerry mentioned, the Carlyle Group, we're headquartered here in Washington, D.C. It's a global private equity merchant bank, and we probably do more leveraged buyout and venture capital investing related to defense and dual-use technology than any other private equity firm in the world. The defense industry valuation will grow primarily from two factors. One is that either the size of the defense pie gets bigger, as it has been over several years, or the slice of the pie related to that particular part of the defense industry gets bigger.
The Carlyle Group plays in industries and in an area that are heavily influenced by politics. And in order to do that effectively, they hire some of the best-known politicians from all over the world.
The first thing is, where do the dollars go? What is the defense budget and what does it look like? This is the way it's commonly captured by the DoD controller. And there's roughly $380 billion in the FY04 defense budget that was recently submitted.
They hire defense experts like Frank Carlucci or Frank Finelli. They hire politicians like George Bush Sr. or James Baker III, and they hire businessmen, a number of MBAs, Ivy League MBAs, very, very bright business people from around the world.
Most people think about this topic as simply the Iron Triangle, the relationship of the Pentagon with Congress and industry. So I'm a practitioner who has been on all three sides of this triangle over the last 25 years or so, and it really has been a lot of fun.
The Iron Triangle is in some ways a uniquely American phenomenon. It's the confluence of the military, big business, and politics. And the combination of these three things is something that a number of U.S. presidents in the past have warned against. In particular, Dwight Eisenhower was very upfront about warning against the possibility of creating a military-industrial complex. By that he means a group of a business built around defense and military that becomes so large and so powerful that it's actually able to influence the politics of war. Nothing sort of personifies that euphemism of the Iron Triangle better than the Carlyle Group. They have it all in under one roof. Carlyle was founded basically on a fluke. A couple of guys, this guy Steve Norris, who was a Marriott executive, got together with with David Rubenstein, who was a former Carter aide. The two of them met frequently at a hotel in New York called the Carlisle Hotel. It's up on the Upper East Side. It's a beautiful, old, plush hotel.
I always liked Carlisle. It sounded English, it sounded old worldly, it just seemed to have the right kind of ring to it.
So it was essentially, this sort of fabricated legacy of sounding like they had a history of success and big money, old money.
And ultimately, at the end of the day, no one had a better idea.
But they made a very strange decision. They decided to base the company in Washington, D.C., which at the time no one could really understand because all private equity firms of this nature were based in New York.
But as we talked to people about it, particularly some of the people that both David Rubenstein and I worked with, they thought we'd lost our minds, that it was too late, that what do we know about establishing a merchant banking business. I was a finance guy from Marriott, and David was a lawyer. But we had this dream to build a merchant bank, a private equity investment firm that could take capital and intermediate that capital into companies or real estate or venture capital. At the outset, we really didn't envision entirely where it might go. We saw it simply an opportunity to take advantage of Washington and the people here and the access that people had to transactions.
So to base the company in Washington, D.C. was a very strange decision, but as it turned out, it proved to be an extremely successful decision because of the direction that Carlyle eventually went in, which was to play in these very heavily government-regulated industries and to use ex-politicians to sort of pave the way for them.
We started buying shares of a company called Fairchild, which was here in the Washington area, because we thought it was very cheap.
And what kind of company was that?
It's defense business. They had a satellite business, which we thought was very attractive and undervalued. And we invested in Fairchild. At one point, we had, I think, almost 25% of the company. And it was ultimately sold, and we made an enormous amount of money. And we began to see the opportunities in that area, and which is one of the reasons why, at the end of the Reagan administration, we were very interested in Frank Carlucci.
I will name as the next Secretary of Defense the best qualified man in America to carry on CAP's work, Frank Carlucci.
When Frank Carlucci came on board, he was coming straight from the Pentagon as Secretary of Defense. He had just, Reagan's term had just finished and Carlucci retired. He came on board and really took them in a completely new direction into defense. This was a time, bear in mind, where defense properties were worth almost nothing because the Cold War had just ended, and this huge military buildup that had taken place during the 80s had suddenly evaporated, which marked a great opportunity, and no one knew that better than Frank Carlucci, who had been in the Pentagon watching this whole trend happen firsthand. So Carlucci came on board and was able to take Carlyle 180 degrees in another direction. Sure enough, a year, 2 years later, the Gulf War hit. And everybody knows that wartime is boom time for the defense industry. So once the Gulf War hit, these properties skyrocketed again. And Carlyle made a ton of money. They did very, very well. They really cleaned up during that 3 or 4 year swing. And after that, Carlyle said, hey, having these politicians on board is pretty great. I mean, they know things that nobody else knows. In fact, Frank Carlucci was setting up policies while he was in office as Secretary of Defense that he's now capitalizing on as chairman of Carlyle Group. And, it's a brilliant scheme if you think about it. You set up the policies, you leave office, you go into business, and then you exploit those policies. They picked up George Bush, James Baker.
Richard Darman is over there, who was a former budget director in the White House.
Arthur Levitt, the former SEC chairman. William Kennard, the former FCC chairman.
In Europe, you have former Prime Minister of England, John Major, Karl Otto Pohl from the head of the German Central Bank, Eberhard Kuhnheim, who's the chairman of the supervisory board of BMW, the Asia part, former Prime Minister of Thailand, former president of the Philippines, Fidel Ramos, and at one point also the former former Prime Minister of South Korea was on their board, a man named Mr. Park, who used to head up the largest steel company in South Korea.
The list just goes on and on and on. So these guys carry a tremendous amount of influence, and they are able to predict trends in global markets, predict trends in political shifts, and in some ways, and this is the sort of the most insidious part, and if you want to be cynical about the Carlyle Group, you have to be concerned about their ability to influence these trends and actually affect change in government policy, which would positively affect their investments.
Former government officials tended, before Carlyle, to go to academic institutions, or they tended to, some just retired, or many of them became lobbyists. Well, for someone like Jim Baker, who really had been at the pinnacle of American power for over 10 years, he'd been chief of staff, he'd been secretary of the Treasury, ultimately secretary of state, for Jim Baker to be a lobbyist or even to be a lawyer was not something that was terribly interested in him.
If you're a Republican during a Democratic administration in the White House, for example, someone like James Baker, you're able to revolve out of the White House into the Carlyle Group, work there for a period of time, and then when that Democratic administration is through, like Clinton's was through in 2000, you're able to revolve right back into the White House. Colin Powell did that. Colin Powell did a little consulting for the Carlyle Group. He knows the guys very well. He knows Frank Carlucci very well. Frank Carlucci was his mentor as he came up through the ranks. And I think his relationship with the Carlyle Group personifies the gray area that the Carlyle Group works within. Some of these guys are never officially hired. You know, some of them are only put on retainer. Some of them are paid in very ambiguous ways, like through investments that they make through the Carlyle Group or the amount of money that they help raise, that kind of thing. So it's never really clear at any given time who exactly is working for the Carlyle Group. No one really knows unless, you know, they officially... Unless the Carlyle Group wants you to know. If the Carlyle Group wants you to know, then they put them up on the website and they put them in their brochures and that kind of thing. But if you look on the Carlyle website today, you don't see George Bush Sr.'s name anywhere, although he is working for the Carlyle Group. George Bush Sr. is a fundraiser. He is the kind of guy who can go into Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, where they love him, pack the house, and get these guys to open up their wallets and give money to the Carlyle Group. That's his role. But if you look in over the history of this company, George Bush Sr. has clearly met with business leaders one-on-one, met with political leaders in South Korea and in Saudi Arabia, and that would lead one to believe that he's doing much, much more than just giving speeches for the Carlyle Group.
So I got a call one day from Carlyle after I blasted them in the papers, and they said that maybe we should get together and talk. We had breakfast at the Mayflower Hotel. Everything was going just fine. We were eating our eggs and bacon and talking about the weather, and then somewhere in the middle to the late part of the meal, he said, "How come you're trashing former President Bush?" And he said, "He's a very, very good, decent man, and you know, I think it's really unfair what you've been doing about former President Bush." And I said, "Well, you know, all you have to do is tell the world what exactly he's doing for you." And I said, "What is he doing for you? And what's his position there? How much money did he make last year?" And he said, "Well, I can't tell you how much he made. Has no official position." And I said, "Yes, he does. He was the head of your business council in Asia. Last I checked, he still is." And he goes, "Well, that's just an advisory post." And he said he just gives speeches. And I go, "How much does he get a speech?" And I said, "I heard it's well over $100,000 every time he opens his mouth." And I said, "So if it's just a few speeches, why don't you just tell us where and when and how much? And then people like me will go away." And he said, "Well, that's not possible."
George Bush Sr. made it after he left the presidency. He was working for Carlyle and made several swings through East Asia, going to Thailand, going to South Korea and other places, sort of looking for investment opportunities for Carlyle. And Carlyle finally settled on South Korea. And then the way that overlaps with policy is during the Asia crisis, the International Monetary Fund came in with this rescue package for South Korea that the United States backed. And the U.S. used the IMF crisis to push through deregulation and changes in rules around foreign ownership, the changes that they'd been unable to press through, maybe 25 or 30 years of trade policy. In a matter of months, under this IMF package, they just rammed all these changes through. And one of the changes was allowing foreign banks to take ownership shares, controlling shares of Korean banks. And so Carlyle has been right in there, and they've bought one of the largest banks there, commercial banks. And so you can say that, Bush Sr. didn't cut the deal, but when someone comes of that stature, that gives a kind of stamp of approval for people wondering who this investment group is. They say, well, it's backed by the former president of the United States, and it carries a lot of weight.
I have said that it's the worst kind of conflict of interest, particularly when your son is the president of the United States. So while Junior is talking to heads of state about war and other weighty matters, Papa is talking to them or having conversations with them about Carlyle, and it's just, I find it disgusting.
Carlyle bought United Defense, which is one of the largest military contractors in the country, in 1997, and they went on to work with United Defense on a very specific program called the Crusader. The Crusader is a huge howitzer. It's a mobile gun, but it came under fire by a defense panel that was paid to review the all defense purchases of the Pentagon.
One fateful day, we were having a hearing on the upcoming defense authorization legislation, which is going to authorize almost an unprecedented amount of money for defense spending, $400 billion.
After September 11th, huge defense money was unearthed.
Our men and women deserve the best weapons, the best equipment, and the best training. And therefore, I've asked Congress for a one-year increase of more than $48 billion for national defense, the largest increase in a generation.
The defense panel looked at the Crusader weapon in 1998, and they determined that it was too big and too slow for the modern-day warfare that the United States was likely to engage in, and the panel recommended that the gun be the gun contract be terminated.
We need to be agile and mobile, and therefore we need to replace aging aircraft and get ready to be able to defend freedom with the best equipment possible.
Members of the Pentagon had come and testified on Capitol Hill and said, no. We don't want the Crusader because it doesn't fit in with our priorities. But as a part of that $48.1 billion increase in the $400 billion defense request that came down from the president, inside there was money for the Crusader missile. So then I started doing my research, and I learned that the Crusader missile was manufactured by United Defense Industries, and that company was owned by the Carlyle Group, and that the president's father was on the payroll of the Carlyle Group. And I said to myself, now, in all of the ethics briefings that we've had in Congress, this is something that we're supposed to stay away from in our own personal conduct. So when the time came for us to vote, our committee to vote on the defense authorization bill, I voted no. And I also wrote a dissent, and prominently featured in my dissent is mention of the Carlyle Group and its relationship to the Crusader missile. And then that's when everything began to fall apart.
What ended up happening was a wave of sentiment against the Crusader began to build on Capitol Hill and within the Department of Defense. And this was something that the Carlyle Group didn't foresee. And they began to wield their influence. They sent people around to key politicians, representatives, and senators, began lobbying very heavily, and was able to keep this gun program alive despite an overwhelming sentiment against it.
They didn't realize that there would be this ensuing scrutiny of the request, and therefore, when a little bit of sunshine, which is a great disinfectant, was shed on this particular request, and the relationship between the current president and the former president and this particular weapon system, maybe at that point it was decided we'd better not deal with this, and so they didn't.
Eventually the noise around that got so strong that there was really nothing left to do but to cancel this gun program. And Donald Rumsfeld did cancel the program in a very public ceremony, but not until the gun the gun had been kept alive long enough that the company, United Defense, was able to go public. It did very well, and the Carlyle Group made $237 million in that one day.
And what happened to you?
Well, I was excoriated in the press. I was vilified. I was called unpatriotic. And then a very strange thing happened in my election. I'm a Democrat. What the Republicans did was the Republicans went out and got a black woman who was a Republican to run as a Democrat in my Democratic primary. And then 47,000 Republicans crossed over and voted in my Democratic primary. And of course, they had done their homework and their research, and they realized that generally on average, I would get about 48,000 votes on a primary. Generally on average, give or take 100 here, 100 there, but generally it's about 48,000. So what the Republicans did, and this was not just a mere accident, this of course was planned, and they made sure that at least 47,000, and we can name them, we have their names, addresses, telephone numbers, so we know 47,000 to match the number of Democrats that would generally turn out, voted in my election. And of course, I couldn't, in the circumstances like that, come out on the with the longer stick when the election tally had ended.
People should ask questions about Carlisle. The problem is, what member of Congress, Democrat or Republican, wants to go and criticize a grandfatherly former U.S. president whose son happens to be the sitting president? I mean, why don't you just take a gun and shoot your leg off? I mean, it is not going to be very popular in Washington, D.C. You're not going to be invited to White House dinners. You're going to be shut out on the Hill when you deal with certain members who won't forget that you trashed a former president and his son.
If you have an organization that is able to operate behind the scenes without real accountability, and that same organization has the ability to ruin political careers for people who are a little bit too inquisitive or a little bit too honest, or to shape public thinking, then we have the means for a kind of control globally that is probably unprecedented.
It's sort of like shadow boxing with a ghost. You can't find the ghosts. You can't read their reports because they're privately held, and there's no obvious litigation against them. No one in Congress has had a hearing about them. They're so powerful, no one wants to touch it because of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. Just kidding. So we have this problem here. This is a mysterious, immensely powerful company with virtually no scrutiny.
In the White House view, there's no ethical conflict in former President Bush and former Secretary of State Jim Baker using their world contacts, world leaders, to represent one of the most well-known military arms dealers, the Carlyle Group.
The President has full faith that his family will conform with all proper ethics laws, and will act properly in their conduct, and that's exactly what they've been done, and there are no questions that we can.
It's okay for former President Bush to go to the Middle East leaders and sell guns and tanks and planes?
Again, the President has full confidence that all members of his family are acting in full accordance with all ethics laws.
On September 11th, in somewhat of a horrible coincidence, the Carlyle Group was holding their annual investor meeting here in Washington, D.C., at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. George Bush Sr. was at the meeting. The Carlyle Group said that he left the night before September 11th and was on his way to some location in the Midwest. And I talked to someone who was at the meeting, and they told me that the whole crew of Carlyle, including Frank Carlucci and James Baker and David Rubenstein, along with Shafiq bin Laden, who was a representative of the bin Laden family and their fortunes, were all in the same room together watching the events of September 11th take place. And I was totally shocked. I just couldn't believe that all of these people were in the same room watching these events happen. You know, it's just to see a confluence of international people of such political influence and intrigue to be gathered at the same place at the same time while something that affects all of them in completely different ways took place was just an amazing, amazing scene in my mind.
One of the more embarrassing things that happened was after September 11th, it emerged that the bin Laden family construction company had some money in Carlisle. And after initially denying this, it ended up that George Herbert Walker Bush had met with members of the bin Laden family in one of his trips to Saudi Arabia.
The bin Laden family had been introduced to Carlyle many years before President Bush ever became associated with Carlyle. And they were introduced in a quite legitimate way as a potential investor in one of our investment funds, which they did invest in. And in addition, we offered up and did perform certain financial advisory work in connection with an investment they were thinking about, and indeed one that they did make in the United States, where there was simply hard business analysis and advice rendered. I can tell you, Bakr bin Laden, in his wildest imagination, I suspect, never imagined that Osama would go and do what he did. So then you roll forward 3 or 4 years, and all of a sudden 9/11 has happened, and the first thing you know is, well, President Bush is associated with Carlyle, and Carlyle has some bin Laden money. Well, what's going on here?
The relationships between Carlyle and Saudi Arabia began when Steve Norris developed a very nascent relationship with Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, who is a very wealthy, very flamboyant Saudi Arabian prince who loves the United States and loves to invest his money in the United States.
There was always a running joke, there's always been periods where there were capital excess capital, and people would try to figure out how to access that. For a while it was the Japanese, and it's always been the Kuwaitis and so forth.
And now it was the Saudis.
And that was the Saudis, and people would say, let's try to find a prince to do something. I mean, it was the kind of thing you just said. It was humorous, and no one really... So I remember when I got a call from Dick Paulson saying, we have a prince we want you to talk to. I said, right, what else do you want me to do? What are you trying to do here? Do you want me to take you to lunch? I mean, what is it you really want? He said, no, you got to take this seriously. So I said, all right, okay. Because everybody had heard these stories for years. Prince Al-Walid is the grandson of the founder of the kingdom. It's Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, and Prince Talal, his father, had actually spent a fair amount of time around Washington. In fact, owned a major estate in Washington at one point in time.
At the time, this was in the early 90s, Citigroup, which is America's largest bank, was faltering. It was in serious trouble. It was in danger of declaring bankruptcy. And Steve was able to put together a deal between the Prince and Citigroup in which the Prince invested $590 million into Citicorp. And an investment like this was enough to save the bank, and it was a big deal. It was the biggest deal that Carlyle had ever made.
But then through the Prince, you got also in contact with the other
yes,
people
through the profile and then, as I said, we'd hired this gentleman, Basil Rahim, to introduce us, and so we went to meet with a number of Saudi families. And in fact, as you know, one of the families that was introduced to Carlyle and to me in those days was the bin Laden family.
The reason that all of this was able to happen is that the United States had just completed the Gulf War in, I think, 1991, and the Saudi monarchy was eternally grateful for what the United States had done. It had restabilized the Middle East.
The big spur was the Gulf War, and people seeing, Bush Sr. and James Baker as the heroes of the Gulf War.
The bargain that was struck basically gave the United States preferred access to Saudi energy in return for protection against foreign foes. And when the requirement arose in 1990, the United States kept its end of the bargain, stepped forward and helped to defend the kingdom and then liberate Kuwait. And the result was that there was an enormous outburst of good feeling in both countries. Trade boomed, and the military relationship, of course, became stronger than ever before.
The Saudi people close to the Saudi royal family, as a kind of as a favor to their benefactors, Bush and Baker, encouraged private Saudi business people to invest in the Carlyle Group.
A lot of what I was doing was trying to convince Prince Fahd Abdullah, who I think was an Air Force general, but also he was the minister in charge of the offset program, that Carlyle would be a good financial advisor.
Carlyle managed this program for Saudi Arabia, which essentially was a program that encouraged investment from foreign countries into the kingdom, but the money that was made from those investments had to be reinvested. Some percentage of it had to be reinvested in the kingdom.
You'd say, Your Highness, look, we have access at a higher level to some of these companies who have offset obligations. We think will be helpful to you in getting that interest generated. Now, they're not going to go do something just because Jim Baker says, why don't you do this? Now, can he get a meeting? Yes. Can we go in and make a presentation to the right operating group, and if it makes sense, are they going to take it seriously? Yes. That's what Jim Baker can do.
So Carlyle was managing this program, which made them, in some ways, a gatekeeper to the investment community in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they knew where the money was coming from and where it was going to. So they had a very unique position in Saudi Arabia and grew very close with the royal family, with the bin Laden family, and they were able to really cozy up with the Saudis and get a lot of investments from there.
And this became a huge arena for corruption, because instead of just paying a bribe to somebody in the royal family, now you could set them up in business. And you could say, well, this business is part of our offset commitment to you that goes with this arms sale. And so we're going to take, this son of this prince and create a little company for him that's going to be funded by Boeing. But all Boeing's doing is recycling the money out of the arms deals. They get $9 billion, they kick some of it back. So Carlyle, I think, was brought in to try to put some legitimacy on this process.
That was the foot in the door into Saudi Arabia. From there, they were able to expand their business in the kingdom through, they bought a company called Vanel.
The Vanel Corporation is sensitive. It took the company 5 years to win the contract with the Saudis, and the negative interest displayed by some in Congress and the media has made the company men less than enthusiastic about talking about the Saudi agreement.
We've been in business since 1931, and we've been in Saudi Arabia. We ran the Dhahran Air Base for 5 years for the U.S. government, and we've had technical services operations since 1944.
I was on the board of directors of Vanel for about a year and a half. Carlyle really didn't own that company directly. It was acquired by BDM, which was a company that we owned, or had a controlling interest in, which we'd acquired, as I say earlier, as I mentioned. And Vanel, from what I could see as a director, and I say I was a director of this company for a year and a half, was simply in the business of providing advice and training to the Saudi National Guard.
These are Saudi Arabian recruits at the United States Naval Training Center in San Diego. Classes are conducted in English, but when the men drill, the commands are strictly in Arabic, and the marching style is British.
The Saudi National Guard's main purpose is to defend the Saudi monarchy against internal threats. So this wasn't the case of a U.S. company helping them protect themselves from Iran or another country. It was if there is a challenge to Saudi rule from the Saudi people, this U.S. company is going to help the Saudi National Guard put down that rebellion.
Or at least the appearance of a conflict of interest.
I believe the Carlisle people, at least when I was there, and I know in my own situation, we spent an awful lot of time thinking about that, worrying about
Thinking
that.
about what?
About the appearances of things. About how something we do might be perceived. And whether we care or not about it. And honestly, we simply believe that we had something to offer to the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and to other people with whom we invested in, and that people quite legitimately had built a portfolio of friends and acquaintances and business experience and knowledge of how to deal in high-pressure situations, the tendencies of people, what they might do. We think that's a good thing.
Son is the sitting president of the United States, interacting with the same countries and ruling elites that you and your company are interacting with. It's pretty apparent that there's a conflict issue here. And the problem is, very few people in this country are talking about this. No one really wants to go there. There have been a few sporadic news stories about Carlisle, and there have been a few skunks at the garden party, like myself, talking about the former president. But generally speaking, the glare of publicity and the spotlight of public attention has not been put on former President Bush or his son about this problem.
If the American people knew all the connections between prominent Republicans and Democrats in our country, with Saudi Arabia, with all of these institutions.
Relationships you're talking
Yeah, business and personal relationships with these institutions that have far more to do with funding and sustaining terrorism than Iraq does. George W. Bush would not be reelected in 2004.
This is George W. Bush, the President of the United States. At this moment, the regime of Saddam Hussein is being removed from power, and a long era of fear and cruelty is ending. American and coalition forces are now operating inside Baghdad, and we will not stop
until Saddam's corrupt gang is gone.
I think among the key strategists for the war on Iraq in the Bush administration, there's definitely seen this as part of their plan to transform relationships in the Persian Gulf. And so I think their feeling is that they can have a pliable regime in Baghdad that will play ball on oil politics and so forth. They'll be far better positioned to deal with Saudi Arabia.
If they can remake Iraq into their image, under U.S. control, it'll be much more pliable regime than the Saudis, and they'll have much more freedom of operation in the Middle East. They won't have to depend so much on Saudi Arabia, and they'll have this client state in Iraq.
In the new era that is coming to Iraq, your country will no longer be held captive to the will of a cruel dictator. You will be free, build a better life.
If the U.S. actually takes over Iraq and does this whole rebuilding, they're going to have to rebuild their telecommunications systems. If you're a clever investor and you want to think for the long term, surely they would be thinking telecom. That's one area. The other area, of course, would be defense. United Defense has very extensive investments in Turkey and extensive joint ventures in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. If the U.S. installs a pro-U.S. government, you know that the defense contracts in Iraq are going to go to American companies as well.
Big market, and it's a wealthy country.
What kind of business opportunity for Carlyle could there be in Iraq?
Well, I think they're going to be investing in companies that provide infrastructure, road building, bridge building, telecommunications building companies, establishing all kinds of things, selling refrigerators, selling cell phone system, selling handsets. To the average Iraqi is going to want to have the same cell phone they have in Kuwait. So the big market.
This is going to be a big opportunity then.
I think a big opportunity.
Christine, I gather this turned out to be one of the best weeks in years on Wall Street.
Absolutely, stocks roaring higher here. The Dow up 8 days in a row. That hasn't happened in more than 3 years. And the best week in more than 20 years. And now the Dow and the S&P are positive for the year, erasing all of those big losses from earlier this year. Oil prices, which of course is securing those key oil facilities in southern Iraq.
Lori, first an update. We just received word from the Pentagon. The U.S. and Great Britain say they want the U.S. involved in a post-war Iraq. They also want restarting the Oil for Food program, and they want to make sure the U.S. is involved in humanitarian relief deliveries to the Iraqi people. That's the very latest. Live from Washington, I'm Brian Andrews, 7 News. Okay. I'm gonna,
friends, when I first started reading Dr. Cuddy's works several years ago, I immediately thought he was kind of conspiratorial. But friends, he cites so many sources and authors. Yes, Dr. Cuddy is conspiratorial, but that is because history has a lot going on in it. And this is going to be an exciting interview. We're going to have him on for this broadcast as well as the one that follows, Lord willing, and I know you will want to get your own copy of his new book, The Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan. And in a few, you'll have our announcer come to the microphone and tell you how you can get a copy of his book. Dr. Cuddy, thank you so much for being our guest.
Thanks for having me.
I have been reading your book, and you always have so much information, and I must say it's just loaded with so much documentation. But to start off, Dr. Cuddy, you write much about the Power Elite. What is it, and how do we know that it really exists?
Well, the power elite, as I call them, are a group of individuals, and they've been around for a long, long time. Some of the names are recognizable, like the Rockefellers, and some stay behind the scenes. You don't really hear that much about them, and they're primarily interested in power and control. They don't care about Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. The objective is power and control, and they, through a dialectical process, they are moving us ever forward towards a world socialist government is the ultimate aim, and we know from the words of themselves or people knowledgeable that they do exist. For example, President Woodrow Wilson, when he was running for the presidency in 1912, Carnegie Hall, gave a speech, and I put this at the beginning of this current book that you're offering, where he says there's a power somewhere so complete, so pervasive, so interlocked, so watchful, you better not speak above your breath when you speak condemnation of it. And his chief advisor, Wilson's chief advisor, was Colonel Edward House. And 20 years later, when FDR is president, he writes a letter, and I have a copy of that letter. And FDR is writing to House saying the real truth of the matter is that you, House, and I, FDR, know the financial element in our larger centers is owned, not influence, owned our government since the days of Andrew Jackson, and then more recently, I also included the beginning of the book so that people know that this is ongoing. This is apparently a quote from David Rockefeller himself in his book called Memoirs, published just a few years ago, 2002, where he says, there are those who believe that me and my family, David Rockefeller and his family, are part of a secret cabal conspiring against the best interest of the United States in order to form a more integrated global political and economic structure, if you will. And then he says, if that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it, end quote. And so we know from the words of themselves, like David Rockefeller, or people who are knowledgeable about them, like FDR and Woodrow Wilson, that they do exist. And their plan is ultimately a world socialist government synthesizing Western capitalism and Eastern communism into this world socialist government, and that's where we're headed today.
We are certainly experiencing an economic crisis. This secret Nazi plan involves these Nazi agents being trained, as you point out, to appear as men of large financial clout, gain controlling influence in labor unions and so on and so forth. And then you point out that the term Nazi stands for Nationalist Socialist Party, and these are fascists who believe in private enterprise under government control. Isn't this what we see right today in America?
That's the idea. That's why President Obama is very, very important to them, because he also has a great affinity for the Muslim population. And that's important in the secret Nazi plan, because almost from the very beginning of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood allied with Hitler and the Nazis, and that's why I put it in the book, a picture. And there's many pictures like this. There's Hezbollah, Hamas, or the Palestinian police actually today giving the Nazis salute. And what's important for your listeners and individuals who may be interested in this book to remember is that Nazism stands for National Socialism. And before you get to this world movement that the power elite wants, that each nation has to be moved into National Socialism. And that's where we in the U.S. are headed today, and that's why it was important for the economic crisis that we recently had to allow government to take over General Motors, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and so forth. Clearly a movement towards socialism in this country.
Nazi Germany, with its aircraft, its panzer divisions, certainly needed lots of fuel. And you get into a little bit about Standard Oil and other companies. Now, were these companies actually working with or providing the Nazis with gas and oil? Were they helping the Nazi war machine?
Sure. The power elite, as I call them, actually create these entities. They really created Karl Marx in the 1800s, and then they create a Hitler, and because they have this, like I said, a dialectical process. You find that a lot at the beginning of Hitler's power in 1933 became heavily invested. I put quotes by William Dodd, our American ambassador to Germany, writing back to the U.S. and wondering why all of these high-level American power elite figures, corporations are supporting Hitler because they can't, he says they can't take their profits out of Germany. Why do they keep putting a lot of money in there? And then one of the quotes from Ambassador Dodd's diary, he wrote that in 1941. He was talking about a clique. He called it a clique of U.S. industrialists is, pardon my language, quote, hell-bent to bring a fascist state to supplant our democratic government and is closely with the fascist regime in Germany and Italy. And he goes on with some specifics about how he's seeing that happen. His book was published in 1941, and he's making the comment in his diary in 1937. And so what you have is not only that, people can say, well, you know, we didn't know about World War II at the time in the early 30s, but about 100 to 150 of these major corporate entities actually stayed around during the war in Germany, actually helping Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to have their Wehrmacht war machine continue with its operations, specifically regarding Standard Oil. I put an intelligence memo in there that was received about the Standard Oil of Ohio, saying how on about 20% of this they had actually seen Nazi officers there on the Standard Oil tankers, which were taking oil to the Canary Islands and then transporting them, primarily the German submarines, so they could prosecute the war, but inland as well, so that they wouldn't be sunk. And a lot of other tankers of oil were sunk, but they weren't.
You know, I must say this chapter that you're speaking from was chapter 13, page 82 and following. It's just an eye-opener. Page 84, you provide a picture of a bank statement showing that Argentine dictator Juan Perón and Martin Bormann had a joint bank account. Bormann was successful evidently in spreading the Nazis' assets around the world. And I think, as you point out, this was unveiled in the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah, and let me just sort of, because people may be wondering what the secret Nazi plan is, let me sort of give a brief outline of that. After Pearl Harbor and the U.S. ended the war after December 7, 1941, there was a private meeting between Himmler, head of the SS, and Bormann, who was the party chief. They had all of their trusted lieutenants leave the room, so there's only a couple of them in there. And what they decided was that they, after the U.S. had entered the war, may lose militarily. But they said Nazism, National Socialism, must never lose. And so up until then, from 1933 up until 1941, they had put their best people from the party into the war effort in the late 30s when it began. But after that point, beginning in 1942, what they did was they took them out. In other words, they actually were losing the war deliberately. Now, he was very useful in rousing the public, but nobody ever considered him some kind of great military genius. The real people in the know were the German General Staff, Himmler, Bormann, and a few others, General Reinhard, Gale, and some others. And so what they did was they developed this secret plan to lose the war. It's sort of like if you have a football team and you take your first string out, you're actually trying to lose. He called it a clique of U.S. industrialists is, pardon my language, quote, hell-bent to bring a fascist state to supplant our democratic government and is working closely with the fascist regime in Germany and Italy. And he goes on with some specifics about how he's seeing that happened. His book was published in 1941, and he's making the comment in his diary in 1937. And so what you have is not only that, and people can say, well, you know, we didn't know about World War II at the time in the early 30s, but about 100 to 150 of these major corporate entities actually stayed around during the war in Germany, actually helping Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to have their Wehrmacht war machine continue with its operations. And specifically regarding Standard Oil, I put an intelligence memo in there that was received about Standard Oil of Ohio, saying how on about 20% of the ships they had actually seen Nazi officers there on the Standard Oil tankers, which were taking oil to the Canary Islands and then transporting them, primarily the German submarines, so they could prosecute the war, but inland as well, so that they wouldn't be sunk. And a lot of other tankers of oil companies were sunk, but they weren't.
You know, I must say this chapter that you're speaking from was chapter 13, page 82 and following. It's just an eye-opener. Page 84, you provide a picture of a bank statement showing that Argentine dictator Juan Perón and Martin Bormann had a joint bank account. And Bormann was successful, evidently, in spreading the Nazis' assets around the world. And I think, as you point out, this was unveiled in the Nuremberg trials.
Well, yeah, and let me sort of, because people may be wondering what this secret Nazi plan is, let me sort of give a brief outline of that. After Pearl Harbor and the U.S. ended the war after December 7th, 1941, there was a private meeting between Himmler, head of the SS, and Bormann, who was the party chief. They had all of their trusted lieutenants leave the room, so there's only a couple of them in there. And what they decided was that they, after the U.S. had entered the war, may lose militarily. But they said Nazism, National Socialism, must never lose. And so up until then, from 1933 up until the end of 41, they had put their best people from the party into the war effort in the late 30s when it began. But after that point, beginning in 42, what they did was they took them out. In other words, they actually were losing the war deliberately. Now, Hitler was very useful in rousing the public, but nobody ever considered him some kind of great military genius. The real people in the know were the German General Staff, Himmler, Bormann, and a few others, General Reinhardt, Gehlen, and some others. And so what they did was they developed this secret plan to lose the war. It's sort of like if you have a football team and you take your first string out, you're actually trying to lose the game. And so what they did was they took these people out over a period of time. And what they did was there were really two aspects to it. Number one, they took 200 to 300,000 second and third level Nazis within Germany alone and sent them underground. It was called the Underground Reich. And they would, look like normal people. They wouldn't have the uniforms or anything on. They would be pervasive, shopkeepers, whatever it was. But they were dedicated Nazis. They would even put some of them in concentration camps and have a file on them saying this person is a danger to Hitler, so that when the Allies came in and liberated the concentration camp, they'd see these poor people. Oh, look at this poor person. We got to help him. Let's bring him to America. Let's help this fellow. But they were secretly the Nazis. And then you had the SS types. These were the elite under Himmler, and there were at least 5,000 of them, at least, maybe up to about 50,000. But a prime group of about 5,000, they were extremely versed in languages. They would look and talk. They would look Iranian, talk Farsi. They would look, they could speak Arabic. They'd look Egyptian. Could speak Spanish, and they would look Argentinian. And what they did was they sent them into two successive countries, like to Switzerland and to France, or to Spain and then Argentina, or wherever, and Egypt, and like I said, in Iran. And what they would do is they would look around and find people who would be willing to be front men. And they would really control them, but the local person who was willing to go along with them secretly would be given a tremendous amount of money and buy up corporations. They would buy up trademarks, patent rights, copyrights. And by the end of the war, Bormann had under his control, because he was directing this, he controlled 750 corporations around the world, including in the U.S., or everywhere. And so what he had was, by 1943, with 2 years to go, Bormann had $180 billion in assets at his disposal. Now, in today's dollars, that's worth about $2 to $3 trillion, and that's with 2 years to go. They had looted, every artworks and gold and everything, all for the 1930s. And so while the Allies were winning militarily, this secret plan of the Nazis was being executed to gain economic control of the world, and they said it would take them perhaps 2 generations, which would mean it's coming to fulfillment about now. They would create distrust among the populace of the countries as to their leadership, like, is our leadership really in charge of our economics? Do they know what they're doing? Are they messing things up? They would create these doubts, which is what we're seeing today, and they would also be allied, not only economic crisis, but remember, they were allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is now having these so-called spontaneous revolutions in the Middle East, which really aren't. So the time is now, and that's what the secret plan is all about. The key people would go to 2 successive countries. They would get in, like you said, labor unions, banking, chambers of commerce, and through them they would control the press and the media. And that's what the secret plan is about. They wanted to lose militarily over a period of time, not immediately, and then as they were doing that, get their economic resources dispersed throughout the world. Bormann had $800 million in Argentina alone and so forth. But that's the secret plan.
Dr. Cuddy, you were speaking about Nazis coming to America. In your book, you mentioned Operation Paperclip. It brought many Nazi scientists to the U.S., I guess Wernher von Braun. You speak about I.G. Farben, produced Zyklon B. So many of these Nazis who came here, they look like pretty good guys, but you're saying they were really pro-National Socialism.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There were various operations. There was Operation Paperclip. There was Operation Bloodstone. Operation Bedman is the one they used to take over the operations in Iran. There was a heavy Nazi presence after the Second World War and right on up to today in Iran. That's part of what you're seeing going on over there, as well as in Egypt. They would get in key government positions, and what you would find is that they were across the board. You find actually that, I'll give you an example of how this worked. Himmler would send Paul Dickoff, one of his trusted SS people, in 1942. He was one of these, one of the first ones to go underground. He goes to Bern, Switzerland, and he starts working immediately with Allen Dulles, who was head of the OSS, which is a forerunner of the CIA there in Switzerland. And then, of course, working together, they actually assisted to some extent in our development of the atomic bomb. They had the A-bomb before we did, but they didn't use it. Instead, there was a sort of deal and understanding made. Himmler was working with the Allies long before the end of the war through various people, including Paul Dickoff. And then Dickoff becomes later, from 1968 to 20-some years after the war to 1972, head of Interpol, which is a very strategic position for a Nazi to have. And remember, whenever you say Nazi, you think of these people goose-stepping, with swastikas, but they don't appear like that. After the Second World War, they, appeared like regular business people, and they would get into various corporations. Walter Dornberger, who was head of the V2 and special projects of the Nazis, including some of the facilities building with their atomic research and so forth. He would come over here, be well treated. He'd become head of Bell Aero Systems in Niagara Falls, New York. All these people, welcome. And Wernher von Braun, an SS, I think he was an SS major. He comes over here, prominent person with the Saturn rocket and our space program. And there were a lot of them. Some of them are lesser well known. Some of them would not be German Nazis. There were Romanian Nazis, in all of the places that the Nazis took over. And one of them, his name is Malaxa, came over to Whittier, California. And in Whittier, California, he gave $2 million, his company, to the law firm where a young Richard Nixon was to help him run for Congress in 1948. You had various people going through organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood to, set up certain things. You had the Rat Lines taking a person like Klaus Barbie down to Latin America, where you had these death squads, and you literally had the CIA allied with certain individuals with some of these operations. They were assassination teams. They would get rid of people certain individuals in our government. Allen Dulles became head of the CIA after World War II, and his brother John Foster Dulles was head of the State Department. And so I try to put these details in there, and you find out certain firms like IBM had what was called these Hollerith punch cards. During the 30s, they helped the German branch develop that. And, of course, that punch card technology was used throughout Germany, as IBM's German subsidiary custom designed the machines and then leased them, to the Third Reich, and they could quickly identify and locate people, including European Jewry, who were then, of course, rounded up and so on. And then I.G. Farben, on the other side, you had the Dulles brothers representing I.G. Farben in the court system here, and what you find is that companies like that were connected with the Paralite and the Dulles brothers, they mysteriously avoided getting bombed. I.G. Farben plants, 87% of them were still intact at the end of the war, even though you'd think we would have been bombing them, because they were producing a lot of the war-making material. So through the war and after the war, the secret plan proceeded. And like I say, there are certain individuals like Allen Dulles who are agents of the Paralite. They're not members of it, but they're agents of the Paralite executing these plans.
Now, a moment ago, you mentioned something that I want to get back up into. You spoke about Iran. Didn't the Germans, the Nazis, believe that the Aryan race had some kind of roots in Iran? Isn't there some kind of racial, ethnic, people group connection there?
Yeah, in fact, that's what the word means. It's sort of, Iran has a meaning of Aryan. And then what you would find is a sort of a connection where you had, as I mentioned, you have Operation Bloodstone. After the war, there were a lot of these various operations, and Bloodstone was approved by a Frank Wisner with the CIA, and they would actually have assassins. There would be, they would go out and assassinate people, these Nazis who were used during that operation, and that was followed by Operation Bedman, which is the one where the Nazis, we used the Nazis and others in Iran to overthrow Mossadegh, who was the nationalist leader, elected leader of Iran, and installed the Shah of Iran. And so that proceeded apace. And what you had more recently, show the connection to this stuff, you had Frank Wisner Jr. recently. He was the one who was sent as an envoy by President Obama over to Hosni Mubarak, telling him, Hosni, it's time to leave. And the very next day, Mubarak says, I'm leaving, as president of Egypt. So this is a continuation of these various operations. And the actual operation that overthrew Mossadegh was called Ajax. And the Nazis in Iran were very useful and worked together. General Norman Schwarzkopf's father had been with the New Jersey State Police. He retired, and then Allen Dulles used the $10 million slush fund that they had with the CIA in Europe to train people to overthrow the nationalists. The power elite doesn't like strong nationalist leaders, whoever they are, or strong nationalism. That's why Israel is a target of these individuals, and why the Muslim Brotherhood has deliberately planned to gain strength in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and Syria and everywhere else, so that they can basically surround Israel and threaten them and coerce them economically and with other ways. Hamas is sort of opening up the way to more terrorist attacks from the West against Israel. And so all of this is a strategy to bring about, as I said, this world socialist government. And Iran was very important in that, not only from a military standpoint, but religiously, because we actually paid the Ayatollah Kashani to go along with this overthrowing of the government, Mossadegh, in Iran. And then his protege was Ayatollah Khomeini. And so when it was time for the Shah to leave in the late 70s, we actually put Khomeini into power, and we actually paid him millions and millions of dollars and gave him the arms that we were going to give to the Shah. Thanks for having me.
One of the areas that we don't want to leave out is Israel. And, of course, the economy in America as well as in Israel, I understand, is very precarious. There are some student revolts, the kind of things that are going on in England. Tell us about how Israel fits into this picture.
Well, that'll take a little bit, but it's very useful, and I'm glad you raised that question, because it's strategically and biblically important. And I'll just hit a high spot recently. What you have is NATO has become a peacekeeping surrogate for the New World Order. It's not just my analysis. I have quotes from 1993 where Senator Joe Biden, now Vice President, was talking to Warren Christopher in his confirmation hearings to become Secretary of State, saying exactly that. How can we pursue the New World Order? And then Warren Christopher says, well, we could have NATO become a peacekeeping surrogate. And that's why NATO has been very, very prominent, not only in the Balkans, but now recently in Libya. In terms of economics, what you have is certain key individuals, and I mentioned them at the beginning of the book. You have Javier Solana, very powerful individual with the European Union, and he is literally a creation of the power elite. He was taken as a physics teacher in the state of Virginia. He's from Spain, but he was in the state of Virginia as a physics teacher and made one of the most powerful people in the world by Bill Clinton and Strobe Talbot and our ambassador to Spain, Richard Gardner, all of whom are Rhodes Scholars. And Cecil Rhodes was a member of the power elite. And he had a secret society, the Society of the Elect, he said, to absorb the wealth of the world and take the government of the whole world. And so Javier Solana, as well as others, are on this particular board with George Soros, who's very, George Soros a few years ago literally crushed the economy of Malaysia. You could, at the click of a mouse, you can put billions of dollars into or out of a country and affect their economy drastically. And I remember just a few years ago when Olmert was leader of Israel, he was prosecuting the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and all of a sudden, before the last push, it came to a screeching halt. And everybody says, why would he do this? Well, he had just had a visit from Javier Solana. And I think Javier sort of read him the riot act. If you want any future loans, if you want any future foreign investments, you back off. You can give them a pop, give them a whack, but we don't want any all-out war because, that's not in our interest and not part of the para-elite's interest. And so with that as a preface, let me back up and show how this thing developed over the years. I'll try to whiz through it. And it'll take a little bit, but I think it's very important for your listeners to understand this. What has happened with this ultimate plan of the power elite to create a world socialist government is to create it as a feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L entity. That's why today you see China is feudal and elite at the top, but a very large underclass for cheap labor at the bottom. Same thing with India. Very educated, highly motivated elite at the top, but a large underclass. They used to be called the untouchables in India. You also find in Israel increasingly a shrinking middle class, an elite, and then a lot of people who are in desperate situation economically. And you also see it in California, which often leads the rest of the states. The same in it. You have the middle class is getting hammered with taxes. They're fleeing to Colorado and other places. So it's going to be a feudal system, world socialist government and a feudal system. Now what happened was you have an individual like Cecil Rhodes with a secret society. Lord Milner, Alfred Milner, is the one who executed Rhodes's plan after his death. In 1923, in the House of Lords, Milner says, in the Palestinian area, there should be no Jewish nation or Arab nation. It should be an international area run by this international mandatory authority. So he didn't want a Jewish nation there to begin with. And so what happened was an Iranian named Al-Afghani in the 1800s had become associated with the British intelligence, Cecil Rhodes's plan. And Al-Afghani, he devised with the British an idea of a pan-Islamic crescent running from Egypt all the way over. In fact, you could spread it out today from Spain over to Indonesia. But his plan was he began in Egypt and would come all the way across through the Middle East and over to Pakistan. And this would be a pan-Islamic crescent. And the idea behind that was you wanted to break down national authority, to break down nationalism. You have to convert it to something else. So it became an allegiance to Islam rather than to a particular nation. Now, there are members of the power elite, and they have agents whose loyalty is first to the power elite. One of them is Herbert Samuel. He was Jewish. In the 1918, he's one of the first people I've ever found, and in the House of Lords, and you can find this in the House of Lords record, it's called Hansard. It's like our congressional record. Twice in 1918, Herbert Samuel is referring to a new world order. We need a new world order. So what he did was, as an agent of Milner and the power elite, he put in place the Palestinian area as the head of that, a fellow named al-Husseini. And he immediately, in the 1930s, with the approval of the Muslim Brotherhood, had these almost like death squads. He had been, even before Herbert Samuel, who was Jewish, had put him in power, he had been killing lots of people, including Jews. And they took up, who do you want, the people of the area, and he came in like fourth. But Herbert Samuel put him in there because he would be a tool of the power elite, and he would ally, and the Muslim Brotherhood, with Adolf Hitler. Another person who was Jewish, whose first allegiance, though, was a power elite, was a Hermann Erbin. He was a Nazi. He worked with the Nazis. He worked with the Soviets, and he converted to Islam, supposedly, but he converted to Islam. The point being, there are people who call themselves Christians or Jewish or whatever, but some of them, if they're agents of the power elite, their first loyalty is to the power elite rather than their own particular faith. Okay, so what you had was the effort on the part of the Nazis to build a war machine. And it was built over and over and over again. And what you found was that part of this, in addition to National Socialism, was a philosophy which would allow the Holocaust to occur. And it was based on eugenics. And Rockefeller, the Rockefeller family, was one of the key supporters of eugenics. John D. Rockefeller II introduced Margaret Sanger to the wealthy people. She started the birth control movement and Planned Parenthood, and she would actually say that there were certain dysgenic stocks. These are inferior people. She had a Negro project, lots of abortions for blacks, and she hired some black ministers to sort of mislead blacks as to what they were going on. Other inferior types were Catholics, Gypsies, and Jews. Jews she considered inferior types. And so as part of the eugenics movement, they had to, eliminate or do great damage to those populations. And of course, in addition to the Holocaust, you had about 2 million Catholic Polish people slaughtered in World War II as well. So these were considered dysgenic people. They were to be limited. And so what you had was a very, very supportive type of elitist type people, FDR. Franklin Roosevelt was one of these. At the end of the war, you'll find this in the private papers of Secretary of State Stettinius. Edward Stettinius, 1945. And he's present with FDR, and he's asking FDR, who's about to meet with the king of Saudi Arabia, this Saud family, if FDR is going to give them anything for this cooperation that we want. And FDR flat out says, well, I might just give him meaning American, 6 million Jews. That figure isn't accidental. I might just give him 6 million Jews. Now remember, this is the end of the war, after what Hitler has been doing. And so what you find happening is that during the late part of the war, there's an effort to establish the nation of Israel. And the way that happened was the power elite members, like David Rockefeller, works with the communists. He loves Fidel Castro, Chairman Mao in China. But Nelson Rockefeller is the one who worked with the Nazis. And he basically was in charge of Latin America for us and worked with Allen Dulles. And what happened was Allen and John Foster Dulles' sister, Eleanor Dulles, had married a Jewish person who was connected with the Zionists. And she found out about what Nelson was doing. She gave the papers to the Zionists, and they confronted Nelson Rockefeller and said, look what we got on you. And Nelson said, okay, you got the goods on me. You got a choice. You can have revenge, or I can deliver the Latin American bloc so that you can have the nation of Israel established, and that's what they did. And that's why Israel got passage through the UN. Now, what happened was after the war, you had a statement, this is what the power elite does, and it was talking about the communist dynamics. Secretary of State Dean Rusk under JFK had a report given to him by Lincoln Bloomfield, and it said if the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West would lose whatever incentive it has for world government. So you had to have that tension. So in terms of Israel today, what's going on is the power elites doing the same thing. If the radical Islamic dynamic were greatly abated, Israel would lose whatever incentive it has for world government. So you have to promote this radical Islamic movement going on today, the Muslim Brotherhood, to coerce and put pressure, physical pressure, security pressure, in addition to economic pressure on the nation of Israel. What happened was that the Muslim Brotherhood, when it was founded in 1928, as I said, was allied with al-Husseini and the Nazis. And through the 1930s, what you had is the beginning of various movements, offshoots of that. Hamas is an offshoot of that, of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hezbollah is. Al-Qaeda is. They're offshoots of these, and they all bring pressure, whether they're in Iran or Egypt or whatever, against Israel. And I mentioned that before. But what you have in pressuring Israel is if you look at it, it's a really contradiction. On the one hand, we, the Americans, say we're at war with Al-Qaeda. We're at war on terrorism worldwide against Al-Qaeda. But look at what we're doing in Libya. The Muslim Brotherhood, and especially a lot of members of Al-Qaeda, and a lot of Al-Qaeda members from Libya went to Iraq, as well as the KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army, and so forth. We're helped. We're actually, by helping these rebels, as we call them in Libya, we're helping Al-Qaeda, even though we're supposed to be at war with them globally. And so this will all be used to pressure Israel to do what? What they're trying to do is form regional arrangements. Israel is being coerced into this regional arrangement. They'll call it the Mediterranean Union or the Middle Eastern Union. and they'll be given a carrot and a stick. You know, you cooperate, you'll get into certain loans and foreign investments. You don't, and you won't, and you'll be isolated. So Israel is being pressured to do that. Why? Because what the power elite is doing is linking up regional arrangements. Zbigniew Brzezinski was an advisor to President Jimmy Carter. He was also the first director of David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. He was national security advisor to Jimmy Carter. Well, after that, he has a book that came out in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard. And I have a tape of him in 1995 at Gorbachev's first State of the World Forum here in San Francisco. And in there, Brzezinski, who's an advisor to Obama, an advisor to President Obama today, he said, we're not going to get to world government through one quick leap. What we'll do is use regional arrangements first, regional. So what they want to do is a region develop there, an economic region, they'll call it first. They'll link that up with the European Union, with NAFTA, with the African Union, with ASEAN, and so forth. So that's what's going on today. And the whole process is sort of surround Israel, and the British, as I said, Lord Milner was executing this plan for Cecil Rhodes. And you will actually find, last year, 2010, a Lord James of Blackheath, Lord James, and he has a statement in Hansard saying that he has funded these North African terrorists. And he says, if you try and come after me, talk to the Bank of England because they were supporting me in this. So they actually support these people in doing this. And what they will do is the plan. There's what's called a plan. And the plan is that we will have by 2018 a world currency. That's why we're hammering the middle class today. All of this debt, more debt we're incurring, the devaluation of the dollar through inflation, because the plan, and you can see on the cover of The Economist magazine for January 9th of 1988, that it'll say, pencil in the Phoenix, that'll be the name of it, for 2018. Now, that's 30 years in advance, from 1988 to 2018, but I include in the book 2 references last year by foreign financial ministers saying, yep, we're still on track for 2018 for the world currency called the Phoenix. And so that'll be the next stage on the way to this world government. And Israel, of course, and America have to be coerced into going along with this.
Well, Dr. Cuddy, that's been a tremendous explanation. I remember Mr. Olmert, I believe it was in the summer of 2006, and you spoke about the war coming to a screeching halt, and I wondered if money was involved in that, and certainly, as you pointed out, it really was, and I love your description of NATO as a peacekeeping surrogate for the New World Order. Wow, we're bombing Libya. It looks like this is exactly what is happening. But, you know, Dr. Cuddy, there have been some really unusual developments in America over the last few years. We have, for example, the most pro-abortion-minded president that we've ever had. President Obama is pushing same-sex marriage, gays in the military. I was reading that the American Psychiatric Association wants to destigmatize pedophilia. How do you see the power elite using these changing definitions of marriage, the destruction of the home, attacks on the family? How does this all tie in with their agenda?
Well, it's multifaceted. It's not just a political or economic agenda. They have to control everything, including religion and so on. So when you talk about the American Psychiatric Association, I have put in one of my other books, which you have published, a quote from 1940, and it's in the respected journal Mental Health, and it's by John Rawlings Rees. And he's saying they're basically going to take over everything in terms of the psychiatrists and psychology to create this new world order, as H.G. Wells, the Fabian socialist, who is an agent of the power elite, wrote in his book in 1939. And that was the title of it, The New World Order. And in there, John Rawlings Rees said, we have made a useful attack. He used that word, a useful attack, on 2 professions, that is the profession area of religion and education. And so they see religion and education as something which they have to take over, undermine, control. And as I mentioned, the Rockefellers have been very, very heavily into this. And I mentioned a 1959 book called Mid-Century Challenge, Barricade Challenge, by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And in there, they use the term, and it's 1959, they use that term, New World Order. We have to develop a new world order, and the task has fallen to us. And it says this new world order will involve not only politics and economics and so forth. But the first thing they put in there, in there is spiritual. They have to control the spiritual aspect. And in case you think that's sort of odd, of course, I mentioned David Rockefeller set up the Trilateral Commission in 1973, and 6 years later,